This date, 30 years ago, was one of the most infamous days in our area's history. George Banks shot and killed 13 people in Luzerne County, one of the most prolific killing sprees in state history. Tonight, we hear from people who were on the scene of those killings and one man who defended the killer in court. Newswatch 16's Sarah Bajnowski joins with more on the Banks story 30 years later.
Well, Scott, George Banks is now 70 years old. He was sentenced to death for his killing spree, but in recent years was found to be incompetent, meaning the state cannot put him to death. We spoke today to some people who say they will never forget George Banks and the carnage he left behind.
September 25th, 1982. It was a day many in the Wyoming Valley will never forget. Former prison guard George Banks went on a killing spree in Wilkes-Barre in Jenkins Township. When he was done, 13 people were dead, among them 5 of his own children.
I remember when the first call came in, it was a man with a rifle. And then a couple of minutes later, it was shots fired, and they gave the address as Schoolhouse Lane.
Retired Wilkes-Barre police officer Ben Victor was one of the first to respond to a call on Schoolhouse Lane in Wilkes-Barre.
I turned the doorknob and I pushed in, and it opened. And I looked in, and I'll never forget, and I remember till today. I said, "Oh my God, look at the bodies." The brother and sister were in the back bedroom, and you could see the fright on their eyes, and both of them were dead also. But their eyes were still open, but you could see the fright.
Bob Kedlowski has a towing business in Wilkes-Barre. He has a photo of himself on scene that day. He says he was the first inside the house to help control a dog so police could get in.
They made entry into the house and got the dog under control. Then Officer Victor came in and other officers followed. And I was in the house for maybe 20 minutes, half hour, however long it was. It's hard to remember 30 years ago. It was complete carnage. I mean, there was just people were just shot dead. Babies and all.
Al Flora is head of the public defender's office in Luzerne County. 30 years ago, he was an assistant public defender, just out of law school. He was called to help defend George Banks. Flora says it was clear Banks was insane. Banks testified that police killed his victims and moved the bodies to frame him. A jury disagreed. Banks was sentenced to die.
The day he took the stand and testified, I broke down that day in court. Because at that point I knew there was nothing I could do as a lawyer to save him from the death penalty. I remember when he got off the stand, he was walking by me and he just put his hand on my shoulder and just patted me on the shoulder. I mean, you just couldn't imagine anything like that happening in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania.
And in 2010, George Banks was found to be incompetent to be executed. He's currently living at a maximum security prison outside of Philadelphia. Again, he is 70 years old. Now, each of the people we spoke with today has their own story about what happened 30 years ago, but they all agree they will never forget it. Scott?
Nobody will. Thank you, Sarah.